Welcome to the Action Network podcast. This is your British Open preview. Lucky for me, I'm joined by our golf experts, Spencer Aguiar and Kyle Murray, as we unpack the 154th Open Championship. It's going to be played this week at Royal Birkdale Golf Club in Southport, about 45 minutes north of Liverpool. And when you talk about this course, you have to look at it through the lens of the post-2017 renovations by Mackenzie and Ebert. They reshaped the back nine. I think that's what's really the biggest element of the new challenge, or at least in the last 10 years on this course. They added 89 yards to that back nine. And really, that's where the biggest test in this closing stretch is located. So I'll get both of your takes on that. Weather-wise, first, though, it's going to be warm, not hot, but it will be dry, and wind isn't projected to hit the double digits. So the images of Opens of yesteryear with the field battling the elements, that's not on the table as of right now. Of course, it's the UK. Weather can change on a dime, so something to keep a track of as we move closer to Thursday. The field itself, as I mentioned, they may not be battling necessarily those elements, but they're going to be battling each other, and it's as star-studded as you could imagine as one of the majors. Only two golfers, Scotty Scheffler and Rory McIlroy, are shorter than 18-1. Scotty at plus 650 and Rory plus 840. But let's talk about this track, Spencer. Let's get it started here. What is the most significant feature of this course for you, and how does it impact your model?
I think that's a good question. I mean, you talked about part of it, I would say at the very beginning, that it's going to be firmer and faster conditions than we've probably gotten here in the past. And if you look at this venue as a whole, like in 2008 or 2017, specifically the 2008 version, that's one of the most difficult Open championships that we've seen in some time, with the winning score being over par. I don't think you're necessarily going to get as much of that during this go around. As you said, the weather looks pretty, by European standards, pristine. Like, you're always going to have wind that's going to come into play. It's a coastal course that at any given time, gusts are going to hit the area, and it's one of the hard things to predict. But you don't see the 60-mile-per-hour gusts in the forecast that you sometimes get for a venue like this. When I ran numbers and I looked at this course, if you look at both of those iterations in 2008 and 2017, there was this compounding impact of accuracy off the tee. Being wayward and missing the short grass on your first shot really started to compile and compound on itself in situations. So, like, miss by a little, and I think you can still find yourself in a favorable spot. When you miss by a lot, you start to see this overall landscape of the rough, the large dunes spread throughout, the overall still windy nature that you're still going to have some winds there that take toll on this field. And I thought that was probably, for me, one of the more interesting quirks that I wanted to try to look into, because these fairways, unlike some of the link style courses that you get, are very flat in nature. It doesn't mean that there's not creativity that you come to expect from an Open Championship throughout, but a lot of that is more of the oddity holds true as you go off course or you miss your target, not necessarily when you hit the short grass here. So I kind of took to double down on the thought of off the tee. I saw really large upticks in off the tee and around the green acumen needed to survive this course. I think players that can find the short grass and scramble when they don't hit a green are going to be the ones that do better than those who miss the fairway and then find themselves with a true half shot or even sometimes full shot penalty when they have to hack it out. There is a big discussion in the space of what does that mean from a metric standpoint? What should we be looking at most heavily? And at the end of the day, it's a little bit closer to average than I normally would get on all the 4 strokes gained metrics across the board, which technically means putting is going to be less based off of that answer. I'm always more on the less side. I know Kyle is himself, but I'm even less than I usually am in that area. I think the approach stuff is the tricky part. I would be curious to hear Kyle's answer on this, because these are hard greens to hit. And I noticed in my model that players that had thrived in the past at courses where there's difficult approach shots are typically the ones that seem to do well here over and over again. So long irons would probably be the if we're trying to find a bucket here, 150 plus yards would be where I am trying to locate. But more so than that, I'm just looking for creativity, players that can take difficult and different shots and shapes with those approaches coming in. But like, the number one recipe for me is you have to be in the short grass to be able to do any of that. And then a good stout scrambling game is going to really work itself up the leaderboard. So there's a lot of names, Michael, that I'll talk about throughout the show that fit that profile, but that's how I built my model this week.
Now, Kyle, you were just on the Favorites podcast, cutting it up with that team, talking about, your plays and the course itself. Is this such an intricate course that has so many different outcomes that you can find different entry points into discussing it? Or are you a little bit more in that tunnel vision mindset where your model is showing, hey, there's this handful of golfers that everything matches in terms of, their shot making, in terms of their recent form, history with the track, everything like that. So is it tighter for you, or is this something where you can really kind of talk all day about this course and take it in different directions?
Yeah, I would say it's on the tighter side in terms of the way my model is seeing things and the way I'm sort of seeing things this week. I do think that there are a couple of, I guess, longer shot names that sort of, in my opinion, they're just a little bit mispriced, where they sort of do fit that profile, that mold, but maybe the market's not seeing it that way. So I think that there's a couple of ways of sort of approaching that question, but I would say overall in general that it's a pretty tighter range of outcomes for me in terms of the guys who I'm looking at to have a good chance this week. I think it's a little bit different than last week, where last week I was a little bit higher on maybe some longer shots for the Scottish Open, but I think Spencer outlined it pretty well. I mean, in terms of what I'm seeing for this course, sounds like I agree with him quite a bit. I'm grading putting as the least important stat for me this week, and I'm very high in terms of comparing it to previous weeks, even comparing it to last week where we saw a similar style. Obviously, it's not going to be cut and paste, but in terms of around the green play, that's going to be a very important and crucial feature this week for me. I even went and sort of kind of put together a metric of links game around the green play, where kind of looking more at sand saves and these sorts of lies that we're going to typically see. And I think that Spencer laid it out great. I do think that you guys have both talked about the wind. Personally, when we get these sorts of events, I kind of like to see the wind because I think it makes modeling it a little bit easier in terms of keying in on some guys who play well in those conditions and sort of fading guys who don't. But then again, you have this sort of narrative on some guys who maybe haven't performed well in the wind in the past, and you go to an open style event here where you're automatically getting discounts on those guys because of their narrative or their reputation for not playing well on style courses or in the wind. But yeah, this is still going to be a link style course, but obviously these courses play completely different. We talked about it a lot last week, where we've seen huge amounts of sway in terms of the scoring based on the wind. And that's going to be the same thing here. I think it's going to be obviously much more difficult this week than last, regardless. But obviously, if the wind isn't going to be howling like we've seen it at times at British Opens in the past, it's certainly going to play a little bit different. So I think it also opens up some value for those guys as well. But for the most part, I would say it's a pretty core group of guys that I'm looking at.
All right, let's get into some of your plays here. We're going to start with you, Spencer, in the head-to-head market. You like Maverick McNeely plus 105 over Brooks Koepka. And when you look at Brooks from 2015 to 2021, he had 4 top 10s at the Open Championship. But since then, he's been cut twice at the British Open, tied for 64th, tied for 43rd. Toss in some injury concerns. And listen, I get it. Brooks is still a name. But for him to be favored here, I don't necessarily see that. And I guess my question is this play predicated on Maverick playing consistently and banking on Brooks imploding? Or do you think there's a world where Maverick finishes inside the top 20 and just outguns him?
I mean, honestly, in this situation, I think you get a little bit of both to this answer. I bet Maverick McNeely last year at the Open Championship at a triple-digit number. I don't have him on my outright card during this go-around, but if you've listened to this major podcast that we've done throughout the year, McNeely's been a large staple of conversations. I've bet him to make the cut in pretty much every single major that we've talked about. And unfortunately for this iteration of this event, you're not going to necessarily get the price that we were getting in some of these other tournaments where he was closer in the minus 120, minus 130, minus 140 range. We now have him over minus 200. So when I was trying to find things, and at the end of the day, it's like the one thing I always say when I talk about matchups is I'm trying to find a player to fade more than anything else. When you can find both situations to work together of having a player that you also want to back against them, that's where you get these large disparities that come into play in my model, to where there are multiple outlets for victory. There's the victory that ensues if Koepka is still injured. There's still problems that are going on in that area. He misses the cut. And there's also the flip side of that, where McNeely is a fringe top 25 golfer in my model through a lot of the different metrics that I am trying to pull from that really like him. Like I think of the win stuff, and I agree with Kyle in a vacuum situation here. I think what ends up happening at these majors in general is you get overcorrection that occurs on name brand golfers. And a lot of times it causes other options to either float higher than they should be because the perception is that those golfers cannot win the golf tournament. Whether that remains true or not in this situation, it sometimes ends up trickling out into placement wagers, into matchups. And I thought this was one of those situations where you take Koepka specifically in this spot. You know, he opens at 50-1 almost across the board at places, and we've seen nothing but him drifting up. And I think the market is starting to correct itself. But when you get this large disparity to start where one name is a triple digit option, the other one's at 50-1 because of name brand and name recognition, and you get a golfer with McNeely that, yeah, you might be lacking some of those high-end results and high-end finishes. He is churning out top 40s week in and week out, and he's doing it consistently at the majors over and over again. I think I've come on even, Michael, and talked about him to be top 40 in every major throughout this entire year, not even just the made cut stuff. So it's, as I said, it's not as simple this week to get exposure to him, but this was my favorite way to get exposure. And, you know, the number is on the move as we speak right now. It's the tough thing about recording the show when we do is sometimes these numbers start to shift, but I think there's value on this price up until like the minus 150s, minus 160s, depending on how I run it. So I still think that there's favorable totals no matter where you're finding on McNeely over Koepka.
Kyle, what are your thoughts on Koepka? You know, we talked about it in the Scottish Open preview, coming in with that injury, and he had every opportunity to make the cut. He ends up going with 2 bogeys and a double bogey on the back 9 to miss it by 2 shots. So over 2 days, he showcased a little bit of his ceiling and certainly some concerns, whether it's a physical element, something between the ears, or just not quite locking in and being able to push through some of those more challenging stretches. Do you also agree that he's a little bit overpriced here just because of the name brand element?
Yeah, I think the name brand element is certainly probably a big driving force into it. And again, it's similar to what we talked about last week, but I also think an element to him being a little bit overvalued this week, or maybe starting a little bit overvalued. Like Spencer mentioned, like numbers are sort of starting to drift away from Koepka in the market. But it comes back to injury reporting in golf. And I think when it's difficult to have clarity on that, like it's I think going to lead to maybe mispricing in either direction, I suppose. But for me in this one, I would probably read it as clearly there's not a great feel on the health of Brooks Koepka. We talked about that a lot last week, you know, when we were talking about Marco Penge and how he had a week prior to his upcoming week where he played well. We haven't had that with Brooks. He obviously withdrew the Canadian Open, and now he's missed 2 cuts in a row. And obviously all the speculation about injury stuff is still there and very valid. So for me, it's tough in golf. Like it's difficult to make assumptions. Like in other sports, we can sort of assume, okay, this guy's had a hamstring injury for 2 weeks in the NFL, and maybe, you know, he's going to be limited to start, and maybe he'll come back. You can sort of get those trends a little bit more in terms of assuming or trying to predict them. It's just very difficult in golf because we don't really have an understanding on where these guys are at with injuries. So I think that's also something that leads to maybe some mispricing, and in this case for Brooks Koepka being a little bit overvalued.
In the summer, sweating bets and cooling down with some water ice is good, but the way to make it great is with Action Pro. We've officially launched our summer sale to go along with our brand new features for the World Cup. We have moneyline, over-under, spread, and player prop projections like anytime goal scorer for Action Pro users all throughout the World Cup. Starting now, new users can get 3 months of Action Pro for the price of 2 months. Go to actionnetwork.com/pro to get in on this offer now so you can become the smartest bettor you can be. Spencer mentioned earlier in the show placement wagers potentially being a bit off as they can have this mismatched correlation to, you know, outright odds. And that's not necessarily what you're looking at. And certainly when it looks to, you know, plus money on just making the cut, it's not someone who's going to win this tournament, but you believe that Jesper Svensson at plus 125 is the way to go here. And his recent start at the Genesis Scottish Open, he finished tied for 52nd, 1 under, a fine week, you know, nothing to write home about, but he certainly showed that he's playing well. He's on reasonable footing coming in, particularly on a links heavy stretch, which matters so much in the Open because you want to have that preparation on similar turf coming in. Talk to me more about Jesper and what he brings to the table.
Yeah, it's game fit for me. I like for these majors to try to find some of these plus number options to make the cut that are not going to necessarily be the names that everybody's familiar with, and we're not going to the top of the board. I'm trying to find value as we move across this. And I talked at the very beginning part of this show how much I think it matters to find the fairway and to be able to scramble. And I ended up putting together a metric that was just a 50-50 split of can you find the fairway? What do your numbers look like off the tee? And I tried to merge it to a link style venue for any of these answers for what this is worth. This is not just taking generic stats of a player that can go bomb and gouge in some venue and, you know, you're missing a lot of fairways doing that. I'm always trying to merge the data to fit the course, specifically here, Royal Birkdale that we have this week. So it's like, find me similar courses off the tee and then find me the ability to scramble and have a high end around the green game on link style venues, and what does it produce? And I'm going to rapid fire through these names right now because when I put that category together, you're going to hear pretty much all the top end guys. And in my opinion, one outlier that enters this mix here. So I'm going to do this quickly. Fleetwood, this is in order, by the way, from 1 to 15. Fleetwood, Scheffler, Fitzpatrick, our good boy, Siwoo Kim, that I do like this week. I don't have him in any market, but I think he's a great DFS play. Rory McIlroy, Minwoo Lee, Patrick Cantlay, Keegan Bradley, Cameron Young, John Rahm, Tyrrell Hatton, Russell Henley, Aaron Rai, Robert McIntyre. That's the first 14. The 15th name to enter the mix there, and right beneath him at 16th would be Xander, is Jesper Svensson at 15. It's one of those situations of one of these things does not look like the other. One of these things doesn't belong in this mix, at least from a name recognition standpoint. So when I saw that, I decided to dive deeper into the profile to see, well, what does this look like in other areas? What does the proximity look like at a course like this? And 62nd in my model, when you just put him on any generic venue in overall proximity, he ends up jumping to 27th here. And a lot of that is the hard to hit greens and the difficult approach play and the similar courses. And even he's inside the top 30 for 2026 approach in general. So I really like this profile that he put to the mix here, and that he's kind of bringing us a lot of the link scrambling stuff is above what his baseline looks like. Top 25 player there, inside of the top 35 when we look at off the tee approach and around the green. Kyle's already mentioned it. I'm going to double and triple down on this. That putting is also the lowest for me on this. The putter is the problem for Jesper. Like that's where this big red flag comes into play. 112th in my model. Maybe that ends up capping the upside ever so slightly, but for a bet like this, I just need him to play 4 rounds of golf. And in particular, I really just need him to get to the weekend and get that bet paid and start that third round, and that bet it's going to be a winner. So I thought at plus 125, you know, I came with Putnam at the Open, or the US Open and the PGA Championship, had McNeely at the Masters. This is going to try to go 4 for 4 on this show. This is probably the most volatile of the mix, but top 35 golfer for me overall, which is a massive disparity when you look at the other names next to him in that mix.
All right, Kyle, you're going with a bigger name, Tyrell Hatton, top 20 at plus 175. And I think what's interesting right off the bat is some of the stats just bubble to the surface. His short game and ball striking are both well above average, and links golf generally tends to reward that combination. Creativity around the greens also help flighted command, of those shots, into the wind. We'll see if the wind does spike on Saturday and Sunday, and certainly he's one of the best in the world at working with the wind. He's also no stranger to contending at this major. His best finish came in 2016 when he finished 5th, but he was also top 20 in 3 of his last 4 here at the British Open. Now, he did underwhelm a tiny bit at the Scottish Open, but he still finished in a tie for 17th, so he cashed those top 20 tickets. Where is your cutoff here, or are you diversifying? Are you taking him to win outright, top 5, 10, 20? But why was top 20 the one that you brought specifically for this placement wager?
Yeah, it's been a question I've been asking myself about Hatton here for the last 24 hours, I suppose. Obviously, he projects really well for me. He graded out well. Last week, I brought him to the show as an outright pick, talked about how I bet him top 20 and top 10 as well. Obviously, cashed the top 20, but can't help but be a little bit disappointed based on what I think he should have done. I mean, when you look at his profile from just last week alone. He gained strokes in every category except for approach, which does not sound like a Tyrrell Hatton week. I talked about how typically when you're looking at a Hatton profile, it's great ball striking, struggles with the putter, but I liked him a lot last week because he has had a history of putting well on slow greens. And when I'm talking about putting this week, it's typically going to be the same thing as last week. I think putting is going to be obviously not as important as other categories this week, but when guys have that big swing and splits and they putt great on slow surfaces, and that's exactly what Hatton does this week. I mean, I think that's a big positive for him when you're talking about a guy who really checks a lot of boxes throughout the rest of his game. Obviously, if the wind does get there, I think he's probably going to be a guy who's middle of the pack. For me, I do think that he probably grades out better if there's less wind. I have him as the 37th best player in wind from a strokes gain perspective. So in terms of all those things, Hatton grades out really well. Again, I do think that the reason why I'm not, bringing another outright play for Hatton is mostly price at 36 to 1. I think there's a couple of guys who, a little bit better values in that range, or, even a little bit longer pricing there. So that's the main reason. I guess from an upside perspective, Hatton is still a guy who I do think has that top percentile outcome to win an event like this and to win a major. Obviously, we haven't seen it. He's been a guy who's performed well in lots of majors, but hasn't pulled through and won one. I do still think that he can do that. But for me this week, it just comes down to price. I mean, he still grades out as a value in the outright market, but when you have two or three other guys in this range alone that are either equal or slightly better options here in that price range, that kind of comes down to why he was a top 20 play for me. I also like him as a top 10 option for a little bit of a longer shot there, but overall, that's the main reason why I stuck to top 20 for Hatton.
All right, let's turn to outrights now. Spencer, you're going with Tommy Fleetwood, 21 to 1 to cash here. Fleetwood, for those not in the know, he grew up right down the road from Royal Birkdale, snuck onto the course as a kid, and now he's this hometown favorite, trying to become the first Englishman to win the Open since Nick Faldo in 1992. So a lot of emotion, at least putting wind in his sails. Or you could make the argument that makes you play a little bit tighter with those expectations. I could see either side of the argument, but in terms of his overall ceiling, it's sky high. His fit for this course is exactly where you'd like to see it, but he hasn't scored a top 10 since the Memorial. Why do you see him putting it all together here, Spencer?
It comes down to the math, Michael. I did a show earlier in the week with Jeff Feinberg. For everybody who knows him, I'm sure if you are in the golf space, you do. And I thought Jeff brought up a really good answer as I gave this Fleetwood take. And he compared Fleetwood to Xander before Xander won his first major, to where a lot of people back him every single week. There's disappointment that ensues. There's the discussion that he can't get across the finish line, but you consistently see this price stick in a range that is lower than expectation. And quite frankly, if you look at the sharper markets, continues to push down the board to where in a way where, he opens in the 20s, and at the sharper books, you see him in the teens now. And I think you have to ask yourself the question, I understand that there is this perceived lack of win equity that he brings to the mix, but at the end of the day, all I can do from a model building perspective is try to run numbers and try to run math and figure out statistically where somebody should rank. There are back-end metrics that you can try to recalculate. I even said this last week when I took Fleetwood, where you can condense totals and make it a little bit like I said last week, Fleetwood, I think I said it on this show at least, Fleetwood was one of the best top 20 bets on the board. He ended up being one of the best outright values that I had also. Doesn't get there in the outright market, ends up getting the top 20. So it's like right on part of it, wrong on the other half of it. But I am going to keep betting this as I keep getting prices that are this far off in my model. I have Fleetwood as the third projected favorite in this field. I have him as somebody who is closer to that 16 or 17 to 1 mark than this 20 to 1 totals that we got to open this tournament. And even if we circle this back to the off the tee plus around the green conversation that I had about Svensson and why I liked him, if you remember, Tommy Fleetwood was the number 1 player that came off the board there. That's in front of Scottie Scheffler. It's in front of Matthew Fitzpatrick. It's in front of Rory McIlroy. Doesn't mean that he's necessarily in front of Scottie Scheffler to win from win equity. He's not even ahead of Matthew Fitzpatrick when it looks at the numbers. That would be the 1 and the 2. Fleetwood, surprisingly for everybody who listens, was the 3 for me. Rory is the 4. So a little bit of a hodgepodge output from what the market has, even though it's the same top four there. I just think that at the end of the day, this is a golfer that is always going to get an enhanced price in situations because of the lack of belief from the public that he can get across the finish line. It's every time I bring this name or I post it or it's mentioned on a show or it's mentioned in Discord, like, I understand the risk that I am taking here. I understand that this is a golfer that has not won a lot on the PGA Tour. And if you take the one victory that he does, it's a limited field event. It is a name, though, at the end of the day that wins over in Europe. 8 victories there on the DP World Tour. We've seen him beat all the top players in the world. And I just think it's tough to win a golf event. A lot of those tournaments that he was not able to get across the finish line, yeah, he did not make the putt that he needed to win. It could have been as simple at the Travelers last year. Maybe Keegan doesn't make birdie on 18 and it doesn't force him to make a bogey. You look at the Canadian Open against Nick Taylor, where Nick Taylor ends up draining, I don't know what it was, a 90, 100-foot putt to end up winning. Like, there are so many situations where Fleetwood's been on the wrong end of it. I'm not saying he's going to even necessarily make the putt that it is to win, but if you're up by 2 strokes, sometimes you can just sit there and win. So I'm betting on the price here. And the last thing I want to say before we move into Kyle's pick, I don't know if Kyle has room on his card. I like Tyrrell Hatton quite a bit. If you look at what Hatton did last week, it's a disappointing 17th place finish. He opened this tournament with a triple bogey on hole number 1, shot himself to the very bottom of the leaderboard. Through 9 holes, he's still +3. He plays the last 60 plus holes at 11 under par. I mean, that's not necessarily going to probably get him to win this tournament, but this very easily could have been a top 5 finish. If he finishes top 5, I kind of think with all the steam that he had last week, he's probably inside of the 20s and not closer to this 40-1 number or 35-1 plus, depending on what the best price you can find right now on it. I like Hatton a lot. Hatton's on my outright card. I have a very condensed card that I've put together. It's also very English heavy on it. It's Fleetwood, it's Hatton, and I got a number on Fitzpatrick before that thing dipped early. I don't know if that means that I should also be betting England to win the World Cup. I know that I said earlier on, I don't know a ton about the World Cup, although I will say this, Michael, for not knowing anything about the World Cup, I am 3-0 so far on bets on the World Cup by just kind of betting movement on it. So I'll probably, for the sake of this, bet England to advance past Argentina at least, and we'll go from there and see. But it's a very English-heavy card for me that I have in general.
All right, you're going Tommy Fleetwood, the fan favorite. We're going to go in the opposite direction with Kyle's pick. Wyndham Clark, 41-1. You can argue he's the hottest player on tour. He wins the CJ Cup, Byron Nelson, the U.S. Open, 3rd at the Memorial, tied 5th at the Travelers, just played well at the Scottish Open. Didn't threaten to win that one, but continued to pull that momentum with him. But this number says he's barely a top 15 option to win outright. Does the public just hate him that much? Like, what is the explanation for this? Because I feel like the math's just not mathing. If you go ahead and do a blind taste test, blind resume, don't put his name up there, you're probably closer to 25-1 on a price like this? Like, what is the deal with this number?
Yeah, I think, first of all, when you say that you could argue that he's the hottest player on tour, I think you would actually have an easier argument doing that than arguing that he isn't the hottest player on tour right now. I mean, the way that his game is just shaking out right now, he's in absolute elite form. I think the one thing about his price, and that's part of the reason why I do see so much value here, and I think it's mostly fluff or narrative based, but obviously Spencer and I have some DFS background, and when a player wins an event, usually the next week the public is down on that player, and I think that's the case here, but not necessarily event after event, but it's from one major to the next. I think people have a hard time stepping back and thinking, okay, Wyndham Clark's going to win 2 majors in 1 year, and I think that's a fair sentiment. But when it comes down to how the event is actually going to shake out, what he did at the U.S. Open doesn't really have any bearings on what's going to happen here at the British Open. So I think that's a big reason why we're seeing this number still at 41-1 as the best number that I'm seeing. I mean, when you look at the way that I'm grading out Wyndham Clark this week in my model, first of all, I already talked about the form. His form metric is number 1 in this field in terms of the ceiling that he has. He has the best ceiling of anybody in my model this week as well. From a strokes gain perspective, he's 3rd here, thanks to an incredible run, obviously, over the past few months. But over the last 12 rounds, he's number 1 in total strokes gained. Over the last 24 rounds, still number 1 in total strokes gained. And when you go back over the last 6 months, 7th in total strokes gained in this field. So obviously he's been playing incredibly well. A lot of that has been done with some nice putt luck, or I guess, exceptional putting on the green. He's 3rd in strokes gained putting over the last 24 rounds, but he's getting it done tee to green as well. 4th in tee to green over the last 24 rounds. So when you look at all these things that are just lining up from a form perspective for Wyndham Clark, I think he's someone who certainly strikes me as someone who might be a very streaky player or hot and cold player. Obviously, we've seen it when he won a few years back there at the U.S. Open, where he was on that incredible run and struggled to bounce back after that, and now he's again on a great run. So I do think he is one of those players that you do want to sort of catch when they're in that form. And obviously, I don't think there's much arguing that he is in elite form right now. I've talked about this a couple times, but when we did the U.S. Open, I think the PGA Championship, kind of tried to put together a major pedigree. And obviously, when you're talking about Wyndham Clark, we know he has major pedigree. He already has 2 U.S. Opens. But for this week, I put together a metric that was open pedigree, which is basically obviously high pressure rounds, whether that be big tournaments or 4th round strokes gained totals. And then obviously looking at link style play, U.S. Open and British Open historical finishes. And Wyndham Clark shakes out as the number 2 player in terms of that metric behind just Scotty Scheffler. So obviously there's a lot to say about guys ahead of him in terms of who he has to beat here. There's a ton of talent. Obviously, like you mentioned at the top of the show, that this is obviously a star-studded field, but Wyndham Clark certainly has a couple of legs to stand on in terms of where he's at in terms of the top 10 or top 5 guys in this field. And like you mentioned, he's outside the top 12 in a lot of books and where they're shaking this thing out. So I think there's just a lot of value on Wyndham Clark. He's easily the best value in my model this week. When I was looking at ways to bet him, he was, I think, appearing in 4 of the head-to-head matchups as well. And one of the reasons why I didn't bring a head-to-head pick to the show today is because they're all basically Wyndham Clark as the top plays in my model, and I was already going to talk about him for the outright plays. So yeah, very high on Wyndham Clark this week. And I guess to sum it up, I think the main reason why we are still getting value here is because of the sentiment that, is this really a guy who can win 2 majors in 1 year? Is this really a guy who can go back-to-back at majors? It's just obviously not something that is easy to do. And I think that is leading to maybe some decrease in sentiment. And I know people don't like Wyndham Clark as it is, but I still think that this 40-1, 41-1 number, wherever you can find it, is just too long here.
Let me close the show on this. The last 6 British Opens, there's been some pretty comfortable cushions between first and second place. Scotty won by 4 strokes last year, but twice in the last 6 years, it has been a 6-stroke runaway. And you can get paid handsomely on that. It's almost, let me check the odds here. Best number I could find, 7-1 on the winning margin to be by 5 strokes or more. I'll go to you first, Spencer. Any interest in a runaway, given that the conditions, at least as of recording, should be a little bit calmer on the wind side? Do you see somebody just putting it together and steamrolling the competition?
I mean, if we're looking specifically at names, the 2 that are most likely to do it will obviously probably be Scotty and Rory. I do think that the problem that ensues with a bet like that is, Kyle talked about the weather at the very beginning, and I agree with him wholeheartedly, to where I would rather this be very gusty and out of control. I think it's easier to try to find viewpoints that you can kind of just latch onto and you can attach a lot of weight to them. Without that in the forecast, I would worry a little bit that this thing could clump together and doesn't allow somebody to run it away. I think where you get some of these big disparities is where you get weather edges between waves, where maybe one wave gets completely removed and you get a golfer that is multiple shots better than everybody else when he played that wave, and you see him win by 7 or 8 shots. Like, that would be the negative to all of this. That would be the one, I guess, pushback that I would have. But like, even if you look at when it was played here in 2017, Spieth and Kuchar, while they were very close to one another, they pulled away from the rest of the pack. A little bit of different setup this year, but it's not like historically we haven't seen that come to fruition where you can pull away and separate from the pack. I don't know if it's going to be for me, Mike, but I mean, I think any time that you can find unique markets, and if you think you can find an edge in it, it's always worth having the discussion.
Now, Kyle, I learn new things every single week hosting this show, and there's a new phrase, at least in the golf vernacular, the clumping that we're talking about here. Are you more interested in the clumping and perhaps at 7-2, this going to a playoff, or do you think we're going to whisk properly until this is properly blended and 7-1 for someone to win by 5 strokes or more is the better value play between those two?
Yeah, I mean, I think I talked about the clumping, or I guess the clustering. I know that's a big word for like ownership stuff in DFS, but yeah, I do think it is very important here in the PGA streets, especially this week. I think for me, I would probably, based on the way I'm seeing this top end of guys, I think 50-1 and shorter. There's just a lot of guys in this range to where I would probably tend to believe that it's going to be a pretty closely contested tournament here. But to your point, it has been a trend at the Open, and I do think that 7-1 would be a decent number there. I think that obviously it's not a even money bet there for a reason, but for 7-1, I think that that's certainly worth a look.
All right, that's going to do it for us here on the Action Network podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to check out actionnetwork.com and the Action app for all of our great golf betting and DFS content. And even better, sign up for Action Pro. Go to actionnetwork.com/pro to take advantage of our new World Cup offer. You can get 3 months of Action Pro for the price of 2 months. You can find Spencer on X over at Tee Off Sports and Kyle at KMurDFS. They're on the same handles on our free award-winning Action Network app. For Spencer Aguiar and Kyle Murray, I'm Mike Calabrese. Best of luck with your bets this weekend, and we'll see you here next time on the Action Network podcast.